I never used to believe in possessions. Ghosts, spirits, demons. Those were things for horror movies and folklore, not real life. But one night changed all of that for me. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something from beyond the veil brushed against my life, leaving a shadow that still follows me. It all started when my old college roommate, Tom, called me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in years, but he sounded frantic, desperate even. He begged me to come to his family's old farmhouse in the countryside. "It's Emily," he said, his voice cracking. Emily was his younger sister, a sweet girl I remembered from our college days. I didn't need more details. I could hear the terror in his voice. I agreed to drive out that weekend. The farmhouse stood isolated against the horizon, a silhouette of jagged edges and cracked windows. It was the sort of place that seemed to breathe its own history. Every creak of the wooden floors whispered tales of a bygone era. As I parked my car, I noticed the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Tom greeted me at the door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes and an unsteady tremor in his hands told me that whatever was happening here was eating him alive. He led me inside without a word, just a gesture to follow. The inside of the house was dim, the curtains drawn tightly as if to ward off the outside world. In the living room, Emily sat in an armchair, staring at the floor. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were vacant, hollow pits of darkness. She didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't blink, didn't move. "What happened?" I asked Tom softly, though the house seemed to amplify every sound, making my whisper echo ominously. "It started a month ago," Tom replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She began acting strangely, saying things she never would in languages she doesn't know. Then, she started hurting herself, or something inside her did." A shiver ran down my spine. I'd heard stories like this, but they were always secondhand tales, urban legends. Seeing Emily like this, a girl once vibrant and full of life, reduced to a shell, was unsettling. Have you tried getting help?" I asked hesitantly. "We've had priests, psychologists, everyone we could think of. No one knows what to do," Tom said, his voice breaking. "I was hoping you might talk to her. Maybe she'll listen to you." I nodded, though I had no idea what I could do. I approached Emily carefully, pulling a chair close to hers. Her eyes flickered briefly, acknowledging my presence, or perhaps the movement. "Emily, it's me," I said gently. "Do you remember me?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then slowly she turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. Her lips parted, and a voice that seemed to belong to someone or something else whispered, "He's coming." A chill swept through me, and the room seemed to darken. I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on my chest. I glanced at Tom, who looked as though he might collapse from the tension. "Who's coming, Emily?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. Her eyes glazed over again, and she slumped back into the chair, unresponsive. It was as if whatever had surfaced had retreated, leaving her empty once more. I turned to Tom, feeling the gravity of the situation pulling us both under. "We need to find out what's going on," I said. "Something here is wrong, and I don't think it's just Emily." That night I stayed in the farmhouse. Sleep was elusive in the oppressive silence that enveloped the place. I tossed and turned, haunted by shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of my vision. Every creak of the old house set my nerves on edge, and the wind outside seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. In the early hours of the morning, I awoke with a start. The room was icy cold, my breath visible in the dim light. I heard a noise, a low, guttural growl that resonated through the walls. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time closer, moving through the house with a deliberate, menacing cadence. I threw on my clothes and crept out into the hallway. The farmhouse was eerily still, yet the growling persisted. an undercurrent of malevolence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, until I stood before the door to the basement. The door was ajar, a yawning mouth leading into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, yet something compelled me forward. I descended the creaky steps, each one protesting under my weight, into the inky blackness below. The basement was cold, far colder than it should have been, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. The growling was louder now, echoing off the stone walls, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I fumbled for the light switch, and with a flicker, a single bulb cast a weak glow over the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the center of the basement, drawn crudely on the floor, was a circle of symbols, unfamiliar and foreboding. Emily stood within it, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth moving in silent incantations. Shadows twisted and writhed around her, dark tendrils reaching out as if to caress her skin. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. It was as if she was trapped in another world, unreachable. The air crackled with energy, and I felt a force pushing against me, urging me to leave, to flee. Suddenly, Emily's eyes snapped to mine, and she screamed, a sound so raw and primal it cut through the air like a knife. The shadows recoiled, and the room seemed to shake with the force of her cry. I rushed forward, crossing the boundary of the circle, and grabbed her arm. In that instant, the world seemed to implode. I felt a rush of wind, a cacophony of voices, and then silence. Emily collapsed into my arms, unconscious but breathing. The shadows dissipated, retreating into the corners of the room, leaving nothing but a lingering coldness. We left the farmhouse the next day. Emily awoke with no memory of what had happened, and Tom and I decided it was best not to press her. Whatever had taken hold of her seemed to have released its grip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there lurking. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a possession? A haunting? All I know is that I felt something in that house, something dark and ancient, and it left its mark on me. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear whispers that remind me of that night, echoes of a darkness I hope never to encounter again. I never believed in possession or any of that supernatural mumbo-jumbo until I moved to a small town in the Midwest. I was fresh out of college, ready to start my new job. The town was charming, with its quaint little houses and friendly locals, but there was an unsettling undercurrent that I just couldn't shake. It started with whispers and hushed conversations whenever I wandered into the local diner or grocery store. One night, I was closing up at work. I'd taken a part-time gig at a small bookstore. I stayed late to finish sorting through a shipment of old books. The air was thick with the musty scent of paper and dust, and the only sound was the soft rustle of pages as I flipped through them. That's when I first heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whispering. I paused, straining to listen, but the sounds faded away like smoke in the wind. Thinking it was just my imagination, I continued my work. But the whispers returned, louder this time, a chorus of disembodied voices echoing through the aisles. My heart raced as I realized they seemed to be coming from the corner of the store where an old, dark wooden chest sat. It had been there since the store opened, a relic from a time long past. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the chest. The wood was cold and rough beneath my fingertips, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of old trinkets, faded photographs, a tarnished locket, and a weathered diary. The diary caught my eye. It was bound in cracked leather, and as I opened it, the musty smell of aged paper filled my nostrils. The entries were unsettling. They spoke of a woman named Clara who had lived in the town decades ago. She wrote about her descent into madness, claiming that something had taken hold of her, something that whispered to her at night, driving her to do unspeakable things. The last entry was frantic, the handwriting erratic and barely legible. "It's in me," she wrote. "If you find this, run. It's waiting for you." I felt a chill wash over me, and I slammed the diary shut. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the chest itself were alive, urging me to delve deeper. I wanted to leave, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had suddenly filled the store. But something compelled me to take the diary home. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd read a few entries before bed, dismissing Clara's experiences as mere delusions. But slowly, I began to notice strange occurrences in my apartment. Objects would be slightly out of place, and I'd hear faint whispers echoing through the walls, especially during the night. I brushed it off as stress from my new job, but deep down, an unease began to settle in. I decided to investigate Clara's story further. I visited the local library, sifting through old newspapers and town records. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. Clara had been a beloved member of the community until the whispers took hold of her. She'd become erratic, paranoid, and eventually disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk spoke of her as if she were a ghost, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of the town's history. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The whispers had transformed into a low hum, a constant buzzing in my ears that made it impossible to sleep. I turned on every light in my apartment, but the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, crawling along the walls. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, matching the rhythm of the whispers. Desperate for relief, I reached for the diary, but it felt like a heavy weight in my hands, as if it were trying to pull me down into its dark depths. I opened it again, and my breath caught in my throat. The ink seemed to shift, the words rearranging themselves before my eyes. "I'm still here," it read, "and I want you to join me." Panic surged through me as I threw the diary across the room. It landed with a heavy thud, and the whispers erupted into a cacophony of sounds, filling my mind with chaos. I stumbled to the door, desperate to escape, but it slammed shut as if held by an unseen force. The shadows crept closer, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. "I need you," a voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. I fought against the door, screaming for help, but the only response was the relentless whispering that filled the air. I could feel my sanity slipping away, the darkness closing in around me. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. I heard a soft creak, and the door slowly swung open. The hallway was dimly lit, and I could see the faint outline of a figure standing at the end, shrouded in shadows. "Help me," it pleaded, a voice so familiar yet distorted. I squinted, and my heart dropped as I recognized Clara's face, twisted in anguish. "You have to let me in." In that moment, I realized the truth. The whispers weren't just Clara's. They were calling for me, inviting me into the darkness that had consumed her. I bolted out of the apartment, racing down the stairs, and burst through the front door into the cool night air. I didn't stop until I reached the diner where a few locals were still gathered, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded just moments before. I never went back to that bookstore, nor did I ever open the diary again. The whispers followed me, creeping into my dreams and taunting me in the silence of the night. But the worst part? I can still hear them, even now, a constant reminder of what lies waiting in the dark. A whisper of the unknown that beckons me closer, urging me to join Clara in the shadows. As I sit here telling you this story, I can't help but wonder, what if the whispers are just a breath away, waiting for the right moment to draw me back in? What if they're calling to you too? Because in this town, the line between reality and nightmare is as thin as a whisper, and once you hear it, there's no turning back. I have a story, actually. I don't talk about it much. Too many people give you that look like you're making things up, and honestly, it's something I wish I could forget. It started when I was in college, back when I was living in this old, creaky house with 3 friends. We'd found it cheap online and didn't think much of the fact that it had been on the market for years. The landlord even knocked off a couple $100 on rent if we agreed to keep it in good shape. Seemed like a bargain at the time. The house had this heavy, oppressive atmosphere from the get-go, like the air was thicker than it should be. There was a smell to it, too. Not quite mildew, but something earthy, damp, almost decaying. We just chalked it up to the house's age and figured we'd air it out. But no matter how much we scrubbed or opened the windows, the smell lingered. One of my roommates, Jess, started having nightmares right after we moved in. She'd wake up screaming at least a couple of times a week, drenched in sweat, claiming something was in her room. The first few nights, we'd all laugh it off, just the usual new place jitters. But then she started acting strange. I'd come into her room sometimes to check on her after a nightmare, and she'd be sitting up in bed, eyes wide open but staring at nothing, mumbling under her breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like some guttural language, a whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was like she was in some kind of trance. She'd snap out of it after a few minutes with no memory of what happened. Then there was the night we all heard her. It was a little after 3 a.m., and I woke up to this low, rhythmic chanting echoing down the hallway. My heart was pounding as I crept out of my room. I found Jess in the living room, standing in the middle of the floor with her arms hanging limply by her sides, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were closed, and her lips moved in that same guttural, unnatural language. She was whispering, over and over, but louder this time, like it was building to something. Suddenly she stopped. Her eyes flew open, and she looked at me with this blank, hollow stare that I swear wasn't her. It was like something else was looking through her. Her voice came out low and rasping, and she said, "I told you to leave." Then, as quickly as it started, she snapped back to normal. Her face softened, she looked around confused, and she asked me why I was staring at her like that. She didn't remember a thing. After that night, things got worse. Jess started having blackouts, missing entire chunks of time. She'd find herself standing in different rooms with no idea how she got there. Once, I found her sitting on the basement stairs staring down into the darkness with this twisted smile on her face. She looked up at me, and for a split second, I could have sworn her eyes looked different, darker, like they belonged to someone else. We were all freaked out by then, barely sleeping, tiptoeing around her, unsure of what we were dealing with. And then came the night that broke us. We'd all gone out for the evening, hoping a change of scenery would clear our heads. But Jess insisted on staying home, saying she was too tired. We were gone maybe 3 hours, but when we came back, the house felt wrong, colder than usual. And that smell, it was stronger than ever, like rotten soil and something metallic like rust or blood. We found her sitting in the corner of her bedroom, knees drawn to her chest, rocking back and forth. Her eyes were open, but it was like she wasn't seeing us. She was mumbling again, that same low, otherworldly chant. Her fingers were raw, scraped and bloody, like she'd been clawing at the walls. When we tried to snap her out of it, she didn't react. It was as if we didn't exist. We shook her, yelled her name, even splashed water on her face, but nothing worked. And then, all at once, she went still. She looked up, slowly, and gave us that twisted smile again. And in this voice that sounded like it was coming from deep within her chest, she whispered, "He's here." That was it for us. We packed up our stuff that night, barely even bothering to throw it into bags. We left everything behind and went to stay with friends. Jess ended up in a hospital for a while under observation. They said it was a psychotic episode, but I know what I saw. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, but something was in that house. Something ancient, dark, and hungry. A few months after we moved out, I checked in on Jess. She was better, they said, responding well to treatment. But she never looked at me quite the same. And every now and then I could swear I'd catch her whispering something under her breath, in that same strange, guttural language, as if it had never really left her.